The night was quiet when she heard the groan outside, low, pained, human. Rifle in hand, Clara Dawson opened her cabin door to find a man collapsed in the dust, bleeding, his chest marked with the colors of the Navajo. Every warning she'd ever heard came rushing back. Don't trust them, leave them to die. But when he looked up at her, eyes dark with fear and fever, she saw not an enemy, just a man trying to live. She brought him inside, cleaned his wound, and gave him water. Rest, she whispered. You're safe here. But when the first light of dawn touched the valley, Clara stepped outside and froze. Her cabin was surrounded by warriors on horseback, and every one of them was looking at her. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The morning light poured across the valley like molten gold, catching on every rifle barrel and arrowhead until the air itself seemed to shimmer with danger. Clara Dawson stood in the doorway of her cabin, breath shallow, every instinct screaming at her to run. Yet she didn't move. Her palms faced the warriors, trembling only slightly, the wood of the porch rough beneath her bare feet. The dozen riders fanned out in a silent semicircle, their horses restless, snorting clouds into the crisp dawn air. She could feel their eyes on her, hard, suspicious, assessing as though the fate of her life hung on what they decided she meant by simply standing there. Behind her, the sound of movement. Tahone, the wounded man she'd pulled back from death just hours before, stirred weakly, his voice cutting through the stillness in a hoarse string of syllables she couldn't understand. The words, soft but firm, made the men shift slightly, their grips on their weapons loosening by a hair's breadth. The man who dismounted moved with quiet authority, his long braids tied with red cloth, his chest marked with patterns that spoke of rank and battle. His dark eyes locked onto hers, not angry, not yet merciful, but deep enough to make her pulse stutter. He said something low, measured, and though she couldn't make out the meaning, she understood the demand. Who are you, and why is my son in your home? Clara swallowed, forcing herself to stand taller though her knees felt weak. He was bleeding out, she said, her voice shaking just enough to betray the fear she tried to hide. I only meant to help. She gestured toward the open door behind her, where Tahone leaned against the frame, his bandaged chest rising and falling with effort. The leader's gaze flicked past her to his son, and for a long moment, no one breathed. Then, with slow precision, he lifted a hand and murmured something in their language, a single command. The ring of drawn bows eased. A few, rifles lowered, though no one moved closer. Clara's heart pounded as the older man took a few steps toward her, stopping just short of the porch. He was close enough now that she could see the lines carved into his face, the weight of loss and long seasons in his eyes. You heal him, he said suddenly, in accented but careful English. Why? Clara hesitated, her throat tightening. She could have said she didn't know, could have said she'd done what anyone with a conscience might have done, but she knew better. These weren't men of half-truths or weakness. Because he's human, she answered simply. Same as me. The silence that followed was sharper than any weapon. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the man nodded once, and something like understanding flickered in his gaze. He turned to Tahone and spoke briefly. The younger man responded, his tone respectful, strained by pain but strong. When the leader looked back at her, there was still steel in his stare, but it was no longer aimed like a blade. You keep him, he said, tapping his chest. Until strong. Then we come. Clara's breath caught half in relief, half in dread. Keep him? What did that mean? But before she could ask, he mounted his horse, gave a curt signal, and the riders wheeled away in a ripple of motion, hooves thundering down the slope until the dust swallowed them whole. Only when the last echo had faded did Clara realize how tightly she'd been holding herself. Her arms dropped, her breath shaking out of her chest. She turned back to Tahone, who was still standing, his face pale but his eyes bright with something she couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe, or warning. They'll come back, she said softly. He nodded once, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, and you must not fear. But as she looked toward the empty ridge where the warriors had vanished, Clara wasn't sure if the words were comfort or a promise of the storm still waiting to break. The chief's voice rolled across the hollow like distant thunder. and for a moment Clara felt herself shrink beneath the weight of those many dark eyes fixed on her, as if they could see right through bone and skin to motive and guilt. He accused her flatly. "You bring hurt to our people. You take our son." Each syllable struck with the authority of a life spent reading danger in the horizon. And Clara's answer came out in a rush, simple and urgent. "He would have died." Her hands moving as if to anchor the claim, fingers splayed toward the doorway where Tahone leaned, breath shallow but steady. The bandage at his ribs stained a rusty testimony to what she'd found in the night. She told them how she'd seen him fall, how his blood had pooled in the dust and how the moon had thrown a silver map across his chest, how she'd dragged him inside when no one else would have, how she'd pressed cloth and boiled water and held him against the shiver of fever until the worst of it loosened its grip. Her voice trembled because the memory of that cold, small body nearly gone had cut raw something old in her, but she would not flinch from telling it. The leader's face was a landscape of suspicion and duty. He stepped closer, the beads at his throat catching light, and his eyes held the hard question every man there wanted answered. Why should we trust a stranger? Tahone, though hollowed by pain and leaning on the doorframe like a pillar that might fall, forced his hand free and found her sleeve. He spoke then, his voice a grating thing at first, words of his tongue falling in an uneven cadence that nonetheless carried clear to the ears of those assembled. He said her name. Where names were weight, he called her healer, he called her keeper of breath. And when he turned that gray gaze up to her, his lips bent into something like a tired smile, and he said in clotted English, "She kept me. I live cause of her." The warriors looked to one another, and something shifted in the ring of horses more than curiosity now. A calculation of kin and debt and the brittle math of honor. The chief did not answer right away. He folded his hands, the leather of his gauntlets creaking, and his face went quiet and unreadable as water under ice. For a long, heavy minute he studied Clara, as if measuring her bones for truth, his eyes traveling the lines of her face, the way her jaw had set to steel the moment she'd taken his son inside, the marks on her palms that told a life of hard work rather than soft betrayal. At last he spoke, slow and flat. "You say he live. If you lie, he die, and your blood pay." His words landed like a stone. He did not curse her or order her taken. He did not lash out in instant fury. Instead, he gave a judgment that was itself a blade. Softened by custom, he ordered them to lower arms, and the bowed rifles and the drooping bows made the morning seem to exhale, but his final warning set a new boundary. "If he dies, you die too." The clause was not idle threat. It carried a weight of reciprocal law that chilled Clara more than any drawn weapon could have. The chief's gaze met hers squarely, and for the first time since she'd opened her door, something like fear pricked deep behind her ribs, not for herself alone, but for Tahone and the duty now threading her to men she'd never met. She swallowed hard, feeling the cheap cotton of her shirt against sweat-slick skin, and answered with the kind of quiet that comes from someone who's chosen danger rather than regret. "Then he will not die." Her words were nearly a prayer, and as the warriors began to ease their horses and the chief signaled retreat with a motion of his hand, Clara realized she had been put under a different kind of watch, no longer merely a stranger who dared kindness, but a woman bound to a life she'd not planned for, living at the edge of another people's law and their fierce, fragile mercy. The days that followed passed in uneasy rhythm, like a heartbeat too slow to trust but too steady to ignore. And Clara moved through them with the cautious grace of a woman living beneath the gaze of a dozen unblinking eyes. The Navajo warriors made camp within sight of her cabin, their fires small but constant, thin trails of smoke curling into the sky like signals of patience and warning both. They spoke little to her, their words low and clipped, but she could feel their presence in everything: the crunch of boots outside her window, the soft snort of tethered horses, the faint clink of metal whenever she stepped too close to where one of them stood watch. Inside, Tahone lay on her bed, the fever that had once burned him now easing into fitful sweats. Clara tended him as best she knew how, her world reduced to the rhythm of cloth and water, the sound of her own whispered reassurances, and the steady rise and fall of his chest that proved she hadn't doomed them both. When she changed his bandage, he would sometimes wince but never pull away, his dark eyes following her every motion with the wary respect of a man unused to being touched without pain. She didn't understand his words when he murmured thanks, but she caught their meaning in tone: soft, grateful, surprised. By the third day, the color had begun to creep back into his face, and she found herself startled by the sharpness of his features beneath the healing bruises, the quiet strength that lingered even in weakness. When he could finally sit up, she offered him broth, and after a long hesitation, he took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly, warm and calloused, the contact fleeting yet heavy with meaning. Outside, the guards shifted, their voices carrying in low hums of their language, occasionally glancing through the window as if to remind her that this fragile truce was a thin thread stretched over an abyss. Still, something changed in those quiet hours, not a grand gesture, not a spoken promise, but the small human miracle of two people trying to understand each other through walls older than either could break. He began teaching her words, simple ones at first: water, friend, sky. She repeated them clumsily, earning from him a rare faint smile. In return, she taught him her own thanks. Safe, home words he echoed with deliberate care, his accent wrapping around them like an old song half remembered. Once, when the chief himself came to see his son, he found Clara kneeling beside Tahone, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as she checked the wound. The old man said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her longer than before, his mistrust tempered by the undeniable truth before him: his son lived because of her. When he left, Clara caught Tahone watching her with that same unreadable intensity, and for the first time since the night she'd dragged him out of the dirt, she felt something inside her ease. There was no safety in it, not yet, but there was a kind of peace, fragile, like frost on morning glass, but real enough to touch. By the fifth day, he could walk a few steps without collapsing, and she found herself smiling despite the danger still thick in the air. "You'll ride soon," she told him softly, half to him, half to herself. He looked at her then, his eyes dark and steady, and replied in halting English, "You save me. I not forget." And though the guard still stood their silent watch and the valley still carried its tension like a wound, Clara felt, for the first time in years, that she was no longer entirely alone in the world. The evening settled over the valley like an old blanket, worn and heavy with secrets, and Clara sat on the porch steps with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the last of the light bleed from the horizon while Tahone sat nearby, his chest still bandaged, his voice slow and quiet as he spoke of things she'd never known. His English was halting but sure, each word measured as though weighed before being offered, and in the pauses between them, she felt the ache of history pressing against the air. He told her of the soldiers who had come riding from the east years before, men with rifles and flags who promised peace but brought hunger instead, who took their water first, for the outposts, then their horses, then their land. He spoke of families forced into the canyon with no food, of raids blamed on them for fights they never started, and of the well she now used, the small stone ring pool behind her cabin, where she drew her water every morning, once the heart of his people's world. His father had called it the Earth's vein, he said, because the water that ran there had fed their flocks, cooled their children, and marked the place where the spirits still whispered when the wind turned north. "Your home," he said softly, his dark gaze steady but not accusing, "stands on our bones." The words hit harder than any weapon could have. Clara's throat tightened, her eyes drawn toward the shape of her cabin, her small, hard-won shelter, suddenly feeling less like a refuge and more like a trespass. She wanted to explain that she hadn't known, that when she'd claimed this patch of land it had been empty, forgotten, just earth and silence. But even as she opened her mouth, the excuse curdled. The truth was, she hadn't asked whose silence it was. Guilt stirred deep, rising sharp in her chest like a stone turning over in her stomach. "I didn't know," she said finally, the words trembling in the cool air. "If I had, I never would've." Her voice broke off, and she shook her head, unable to finish. Tahone watched her for a long while, the firelight painting his face in soft copper and shadow, and when he finally spoke, there was no hatred in his tone, only the weary patience of a man who had learned long ago that the world didn't need malice to steal. Ignorance did the work just fine. "You did not take it with gun," he said quietly. "But you drink what is ours. You sleep where we prayed." He looked away then, his jaw tightening as though holding back a tide of memories too heavy to voice. "We fight now not for war, but for water. No water, no life. The crackle of the fire filled the silence that followed, and Clara felt a strange sting at the corners of her eyes. Part shame, part helplessness, part something harder to name. Then maybe, she whispered after a long time, I've been drinking what was never mine to touch. He turned his gaze back to her. Something softer there now. You give life back, he said, nodding toward his healing wound. Maybe the land forgives small. His attempt at comfort felt fragile but real, and she clung to it, though the guilt still burned deep. That night, long after Tahone had fallen asleep, Clara sat awake beside the dying fire, listening to the wind slide down from the hills, carrying faint echoes that might have been nothing more than imagination or the voices of the land itself, whispering of all that had been taken and all that still endured. She thought of leaving, of walking away from the place that was never truly hers. But when she looked at the man sleeping near her hearth, his breath steady, his strength slowly returning, she knew she wouldn't go. Not yet. Not while he still needed her. Not while the past still bled through the soil beneath her feet. The peace of that night was fragile as spun glass, the kind that makes a person hold their breath without realizing it. And when it shattered, it did so with the sharp crack of rifle fire splitting the dark wide open. Clara jolted awake, the sound echoing through the valley like the sky itself had been ripped apart. And before she could even think, she was on her feet, her lantern swinging wild in her grasp as the horses screamed, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder clawed at the air. Outside, the world had turned to chaos, flashes of muzzle fire tearing through the black, men's voices shouting, rough and slurred, their words tangled by liquor and greed. She caught sight of them through the haze, a half-dozen riders cresting the ridge, outlaws by their look, faces masked, their rifles spitting fire toward the Navajo camp. They got gold in them hills. One of them hollered, and another laughed, firing into the shadows. Clara's heart seized. They thought the camp was a bandit hideout they didn't know, or didn't care, that these were men defending their wounded and their dead. Without thinking, she snatched her rifle and ran outside barefoot into the dirt, the cold biting her feet, her voice tearing from her throat before she'd even realized she was screaming. Stop. There's no gold here. Stop shooting. But her words were swallowed by gunfire. A shot rang close, a flash of light, and pain seared across her upper arm like fire licking through cloth. She stumbled, the lantern crashing to the ground, spilling light across the dust that was suddenly painted red. For a second the world tilted, then hands grabbed her, pulling her backward, and she found herself behind a low wall of stacked logs, staring into Tahone's face. He was pale but alive, the old wound straining under his movement, eyes blazing with something fierce and unyielding. Down, he barked, voice rough but commanding, and before she could protest, he was already moving, shouting in his language toward the warriors who had taken positions around the cabin. Their reply came sharp and fast, and then the night erupted, arrows hissing through the dark, answering rifle fire with deadly precision. The air stank of blood and smoke. Horses screamed and fled, their riders falling or scattering under the sudden, terrifying organization of men who knew how to defend their own. Clara pressed her hand to her bleeding arm, the warmth slick between her fingers, and through the haze of fear she caught sight of Tahone again, not the broken, fevered man she'd nursed, but a fighter born of the land itself, moving with a deadly grace that made her breath catch. He reloaded with one hand, steadied the weapon with the other, and each shot cracked the air with certainty, driving the outlaws back until the last of them turned tail and vanished into the night, their curses fading into the distance. The sudden silence that followed felt unreal, heavy with the ringing echo of what had just been lost and what had barely been kept. Clara swayed, her vision dimming, the ground tilting beneath her. "Clara!" she heard him call, and then strong arms were around her, steadying her, lowering her to the earth. "You hurt," he said, his voice raw with concern. "I'm fine," she managed, but her words slurred as the blood kept spilling, hot and unrelenting. He tore a strip from his own shirt, binding her arm tight, his hands sure even as his breath came fast. "No," he said fiercely, his English cracking but his intent clear. "You save me. Now I save you." His face hovered close, eyes searching hers as if willing her to stay awake, and though pain pulsed through every nerve, she felt something else beneath it, the strange, steady calm of trust, of knowing this man who had once been her fear was now her salvation. When she woke again hours later, dawn was breaking, the camp quiet save for the murmur of tired voices and the distant cry of a hawk. Her arm throbbed but was cleanly bandaged, her bedroll pulled close to the fire. Tahone sat beside her, weary but uninjured, his gaze fixed on the sunrise. "They gone," he said softly when he saw her eyes open. "But more will come." She nodded faintly, her throat too tight for words. He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding, forged not in kindness alone but in the fire of survival. Neither had owed the other anything. Yet, somehow, they were bound now by blood, his that she had saved, and hers that he had spilled to keep safe. The days that followed the attack bled together in a haze of smoke, bandages, and wary peace, the kind that lingers only when both sides have seen the same fire and walked away from it alive. Clara's arm burned and throbbed, every movement a reminder of the night she'd run headlong into gunfire for people who hadn't trusted her to begin with. Yet, as she sat on the porch in the mornings, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun crawl over the red hills, she noticed the change, small at first, subtle as wind shifting direction. The warriors no longer watched her with suspicion in their eyes. When they rode by to fetch water or gather wood, they nodded to her now, brief, solemn gestures that felt like the first cracks in a long-held wall. Even the children, who had kept their distance, began to creep closer, whispering among themselves before darting away when she smiled. It was Tahone who told her what they whispered, that the white woman had bled beside them, that her blood had mixed with theirs in the dirt, and that such things bound people tighter than words. The chief, however, remained a figure of silence. She saw him sometimes, standing at the edge of camp, his tall frame carved against the horizon like stone. His gaze would drift toward her, unreadable as ever, before he turned away. She didn't expect gratitude, she hadn't acted for it, but she wondered if he still saw her as a trespasser, or if her actions had begun to weigh differently in his heart. The answer came one evening, just as the light softened to gold and the river below their camp caught fire from the setting Sunday. She was walking, careful but steady now, her arm bound tight beneath her sleeve, when she found him waiting near the water's edge. The air smelled of sage and rain about to fall. He didn't speak at first, and neither did she. Only when the silence had stretched long enough to feel sacred did he reach into the pouch at his side and pull out a small object, wrapped in deerskin. With deliberate motion, he unwrapped it and held it out to her, a pendant, carved from smooth gray river stone, strung through with leather cord. The carving was simple but precise, a pattern that spiraled inward like a river current. "This," he said, his voice deep and even, "for those who show heart in darkness." He paused, studying her face, his eyes softer now, the mistrust gone. "You fight for your life, and for ours. My people remember such things." She hesitated, her throat tightening, unsure whether to take it, unsure she deserved it. But he stepped closer, his large, weathered hand closing gently around hers, pressing the pendant into her palm. "You wear this," he said, "so they know. You are no enemy here." The weight of it was more than she'd expected, not from its size but from its meaning. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the coolness of the stone against her skin, and when she looked up, she found herself meeting the eyes of a man who no longer saw her as an intruder, but as something rarer, an equal. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the river. He inclined his head once, a gesture both dignified and final, then turned and walked back toward camp, his silhouette fading into the dark. As she stood there, the pendant warm now from her touch, Clara realized this was no trinket, it was a bridge, carved not from wood or rope but from respect, earned the hard way. That night, when Tahone saw it hanging around her neck, he smiled faintly and said, "He give you part of our home." She touched the stone lightly, thinking of the water that had shaped it, and for the first time since she'd come to this land, she felt she might finally belong to something larger than her own solitude. The sound of hoofbeats came first, low and rhythmic, carrying across the valley like a storm building from nothing, and Clara felt it in her bones before she saw the riders crest the ridge, A line of blue coats glinting under the noonday sun, rifles slung, their flags snapping sharp against the wind. Her stomach tightened, the world suddenly smaller, meaner. She stepped out onto the porch, her hand brushing against the river stone pendant at her throat as if it might steady her heartbeat. The lead rider, a young lieutenant with a polished saber and eyes too clean to have seen much truth, pulled his horse to a halt a few yards away, dust swirling around him. "Ma'am," he called, his tone clipped and official. "We're looking for Navajo hostiles. Word is they've been seen in this valley, armed, dangerous, and off the reservation." Behind him, his men scanned the horizon, rifles resting easy but ready, the kind of readiness that made Clara's blood run cold. In the distance, she could see faint wisps of smoke where the camp still lingered beyond the bend, the people who'd bled, prayed, and stood beside her now hidden in the folds of the canyon. "Ain't seen any trouble," she said carefully, her voice steady though her heart hammered in her throat. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "We've got orders to check every dwelling, ma'am. You'll step aside." He swung his leg over his saddle, boots crunching in the dry earth as he approached the porch. "This won't take long if you cooperate." Clara's gaze flicked past him to the men behind, one older, his jaw tight, another with nervous fingers twitching near his trigger guard. The smell of powder still clung to them, old and cruel. "You don't need to go in there," she said quietly, planting her feet. "There's nothing for you to find." The lieutenant gave her a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That ain't your call, ma'am. If you're hiding, anyone, the law'll treat you no different than them." His hand brushed the butt of his pistol, and for an instant, she thought of stepping aside, of letting the world roll on as it always did, the strong crushing the broken, the righteous rewriting the story. But then she thought of Tahone's face when he'd spoken of the soldiers stealing their water, of the children's laughter now returning to the camp, of the chief's solemn hand placing the stone in hers. The guilt that had once bound her heart was gone, replaced by something stronger: conviction. She stepped down from the porch, closing the space between them until she could see the sweat darkening his collar. "Ain't no troublemakers here," she said, her voice quiet but hard as iron. "Only men who bled same as us." The words hung in the heat, the kind of truth that cuts deeper than shouting. The lieutenant hesitated, clearly not used to being defied by a woman in dust-worn clothes. "You best think careful, ma'am," he warned. "You're standing between the United States Army and its duty." She lifted her chin, eyes steady. "Then maybe your duty's wrong." A murmur rippled through the ranks behind him, discomfort, a few glances exchanged. One of the older soldiers spat into the dirt, muttering, "She's got grit, I'll give her that." The lieutenant's jaw clenched. Pride wrestled with uncertainty in his young face. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, gesturing to his men. "We're moving on," he said curtly. "Search the canyon. Leave the lady be." Relief crashed over her so hard her knees nearly gave out, but she didn't move until the last horse disappeared beyond the ridge, the echo of hooves fading into the wind. Only then did she let her breath go, trembling as she leaned against the porch rail. A shadow moved behind her. Tahone, standing in the doorway, pale but steady on his feet. "You stand for us," he said softly, his English slow, but certain. "Now your blood is ours." She looked at him, the truth of his words settling deep into her chest, and for the first time since she'd come to this land, Clara Dawson understood that the line between belonging and exile wasn't drawn by birth or color or flag, it was drawn by courage. And that night, as the stars rose over the quiet valley, she touched the pendant again and whispered to the dark, "Ain't no enemies left here, not if I can help it." The air that afternoon was hot and still, the kind of heat that makes the world hum, the kind that sets nerves on edge before anything even happens, and Clara could feel it, the wrongness gathering like thunder before a storm. The soldiers had circled back. She saw the dust before she heard the hoofbeats, a brown haze rising from the ridge as 6 riders came into view, the lieutenant at their head, his face pinched and red with anger. They dismounted hard, boots hitting the dirt like gunshots, and Clara stepped out onto the porch before they reached the door, the river stone pendant cool against her skin, where it hung like both promise and shield. "We were polite before, ma'am," the lieutenant barked, his voice tight. But orders are orders. Either you let us in, or we burn this place to the ground. The words hit her like a slap. Behind him, 2 soldiers struck matches against their belts, the faint rasp setting her heart racing. She saw her life flash in the yellow flare of those sparks, the cabin she'd built board by board, the quiet mornings and long nights, Tahone's slow recovery. Everything she'd dared to make whole again. "You'll have to burn me with it," she said. And though her voice trembled, her stance did not. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he warned, and she could see the indecision flicker in his eyes, the battle between command and conscience. Before she could answer, the forest behind her cabin seemed to breathe a shift in the wind, a whisper of movement, and then, like shadows made flesh, they appeared. The Navajo riders slipped out from the trees in a slow, silent line, horses moving with eerie grace, their faces painted, their bows strung, their rifles aimed low but steady. There were more of them than there had been before, twice as many, and they surrounded the soldiers in a wide crescent, the sun flashing off the polished metal of their weapons. The soldiers froze, every man's hand hovering near his trigger. One of them cursed under his breath. The lieutenant went pale, spinning on his heel to take in the sight. "Jesus," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Stand down. Don't fire unless I say." For a long moment, no one moved, the 2 worlds colliding in the charged silence between life and death. Clara stood in the middle, her breath shallow, the weight of both sides pressing down on her until she thought it might crush her. Then movement slow, deliberate from the line of riders. Tahone rode forward, bareheaded, his dark hair loose around his shoulders, the healing scar across his chest catching the light like a brand. He carried no rifle, only a single spear, which he held upright until he reached the open space between the soldiers and the warriors. Then, in one calm motion, he lowered it, point toward the ground. "No more blood," he said, his English rough but clear enough to carry. "This woman, she saved life. Her home is under our protection." His words hung in the still air, heavy as judgment. The lieutenant blinked, his mouth opening, closing, then opening again. "Under your—" He stopped himself, glancing at Clara, at the wound on her arm, at the quiet steadiness in her eyes. "Ma'am," he started, his tone softening, "you don't know what you're getting mixed up in." Clara shook her head slowly. "I know exactly what I'm in," she said, "and I ain't backing out now." Behind her, the wind caught the trees, the rustle of leaves like distant applause. The lieutenant stood there, another long heartbeat, then finally looked back at his men, young faces, sweat slick and frightened. "Mount up," he said, his voice flat. One of them stared at him, incredulous. "Sir, we can't just—" "That's an order," the lieutenant snapped, louder this time, the sound cracking through the heat. The soldiers obeyed, climbing back into their saddles, glancing nervously at the encircling warriors as they wheeled their horses around. The lieutenant lingered a moment longer, meeting Clara's eyes with something like reluctant respect. "I hope you're right about them," he said. "If you're not, God help you." She gave him a tired smile. "God already did." He nodded once, curt, then spurred his horse forward. The sound of hooves faded down the trail, leaving the dust to settle in their wake. For a long time, no one spoke. Then the chief rode forward from the trees, his expression solemn but proud, and with a slow nod, he said to Clara, "You stand when others run. The land will remember." And as the sun dipped low, washing the valley in amber light, Clara felt the weight of fear lift from her shoulders, replaced by something fierce and steady, the quiet certainty that courage, once born, does not die easily. The morning they left was painted in gold and dust, the kind of light that feels like both blessing and goodbye. Clara stood outside her cabin, the smell of last night's campfire still lingering in the air, watching as the Navajo gathered their things in quiet rhythm, every movement graceful, practiced, like a story told without words. The horses pawed at the earth, restless, their coats glinting in the early Sunday. She could feel the emptiness already creeping in around the edges of her heart, the silence that would come once they were gone. These were people she'd once been told to fear, yet now she couldn't imagine the valley without them. They had rebuilt something in her faith, maybe, or courage, and she knew the ache of their leaving would stay a long time. Tahone approached last, his limp slight now, his chest bound but healing, his eyes clear in a way they hadn't been when she first dragged him half-dead through her doorway. He carried himself with quiet pride, but when he reached her, he stopped and let out a breath that carried the weight of something unspoken. "You saved my life," he said simply, his English smoother now, each word deliberate. "And you saved theirs more than you know." Clara smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I just did what was right." Tahone's gaze held hers, steady, dark, like the deep river pools that never lost their reflection. "Right is not always done," he said. "You stood when others would hide. That is the heart of a warrior." The words hit her harder than she expected. A warrior no one had ever called her that before. She'd been called stubborn, foolish, reckless, but never brave. She looked down at the ground, blinking back the sting in her eyes, and for a moment she saw herself as he did, a woman who'd faced men with guns and still stood her ground. When she looked up again, she said quietly, "Maybe I learned it from you." A small smile touched his lips, rare, fleeting, but real. He turned to leave, but something tugged at her then. Something that told her she couldn't let him go without a piece of what had bound them. She stepped inside the cabin and returned a moment later holding something wrapped in an old scrap of cloth. "Wait," she called softly. Tahone paused, turning back as she approached. "This belonged to my husband," she said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a tarnished silver buckle, its surface worn but still gleaming where the sun touched it. "He used to say silver remembers every hand that's held it. Maybe this one should remember yours." She pressed it into his palm before he could refuse, her voice low but steady. "So you remember that kindness can live in this land too?" For a moment he only stared at it, the metal bright against his weathered skin, then closed his fingers around it with reverence. "Your husband was a strong man," he said. "You stronger still." He tucked the buckle into the folds of his vest, the gesture solemn, like a prayer. "When the wind moves through the red hills, we will remember your name." The words caught her off guard, filling her chest with something sharp and soft all at once. She swallowed, her throat tight. "And I'll remember yours, Tahone." He nodded once, then mounted his horse, the movement fluid and silent. The others followed his lead, one by one, until the last rider disappeared into the shimmer of the horizon. Clara stood there long after they were gone, the breeze lifting her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and smoke. Around her, the land felt different now, not empty, but alive, sacred in a way she hadn't understood before. When she finally turned back toward the cabin, her hand brushed the pendant at her throat, warm from the sun, and she whispered, almost to herself, "Guess I ain't alone after all." And somewhere, far beyond the ridge, the wind answered soft, steady, and kind. Time washed over the valley like the slow bend of a river, carrying away faces and years, but never the story of the woman by the well. Long after Clara Dawson was gone, after the cabin had sagged and the grass had swallowed the trail, folks still spoke her name in the hush of twilight, when the sky turned red and the coyotes called from the ridge. They said she lived out her days in peace, the well beside her home never once running dry, even when the land cracked from drought. Travelers would find her there, gray-haired and quiet, drawing water with her bare hands, the bucket creaking against the rope, her eyes warm as she passed the tin cup to anyone who needed it. She never asked who they were, where they'd come from, or what side they claimed, soldier or Navajo, preacher or outlaw. It made no difference to her. "Water don't judge," she'd say with a small smile. "It just gives." They called her a fool at first, a woman living alone, trusting anyone who rode up. But over the years, even the hardest men learned better. Those who came with greed found their thirst unquenched, their horses uneasy, the air thick with unease. Those who came with need, though with empty hands and weary hearts, always found the well waiting, cold and clear as forgiveness. And no matter how far they traveled after, they'd speak of her, the woman who never turned a soul away. When settlers began to move deeper into the valley, building farms and fences where the open plains once stretched free, they noticed something strange. The Navajo bands who still roamed the hills never touched that land, never took the water, never raised a weapon near it. That place, one old warrior told a surveyor through a translator, belongs to her, the one who saved the wounded man. Her spirit guards the well. So the newcomers learned to respect it too. Some said at dawn, when the light first kissed the rim of the hills, they'd see a shape by the cabin, ruins a woman in a faded dress, hair unbound, standing by the well with a bucket in her hand. Others swore they heard her voice when the wind moved just right, soft and steady, whispering the same words she'd once spoken to a dying man under a blood-red sky. "You're safe here." Children would toss pebbles into the well, watching the ripples shimmer, giggling as if they'd touched something sacred. Old-timers would tip their hats when they passed, remembering their father's stories, how she'd stood between soldiers and warriors, between hate and hope, and somehow made peace with nothing but her courage. Even as the years turned to decades and her cabin finally crumbled into dust, the well remained, its stones worn smooth by hands that remembered. The land around it never failed, no matter the droughts that starved the rest of the valley. Some said it was luck, others said faith. But those who truly knew, who felt the calm when they drank from her water, never doubted the truth. They said Clara Dawson's spirit still watched over that patch of earth, guarding it not with walls or weapons, but with the quiet promise she'd once made to a wounded man and to a world that had forgotten mercy. And on certain nights, when the moon hung low and the prairie breathed like a sleeping child, travelers passing through could hear her voice carried on the wind, gentle, eternal, full of that same simple grace. "You're safe here."